But even as early as the 1960s, you could see what was happening. In 1950, so just after World War II, beginning of the Bretton Woods era, the United States had 20,000 tons of gold. By 1970, we had 9,000 tons of gold. Where did the 11,000 tons go? Well, the answer is 3,000 to Germany, 2,500 to France, 2,500 to Italy, 600 to Japan, et cetera. And as we had all these trading partners and the way the system worked at the time, if you ran a trade deficit, that meant you got their stuff. So we were buying transistor radios and Toyota cars and Sony TVs and French wine and taking vacations in Switzerland. But that meant all those dollars were going overseas. And those trading partners who had these dollar surpluses could cash them in for gold. And they did. And we sent them the gold. And that was how the system worked. But by the late 60s, a run on the bank had developed. A couple of things happened. One was there was a private market that was set up side by side with the official market. So the official market was $35 an ounce. The private market, it could be $40 an ounce, $41 an ounce. It wasn't wild. It wasn't $200 an ounce where it got to sooner than later, but they could cash in dollars for gold at $35 an ounce, turn around and sell the gold in the market for $40 an ounce. That's practically risk-free, and you make an easy profit. And if you want to leverage it, you can make even more. And that was happening, but more to the point, countries are putting the gold in their vaults. So there came a time when Charles de Gaulle sent a destroyer to New York to pick up his gold to bring it back to France, with the under the auspices of the French Navy. So that was exhilarating. So. And it was because there wasn't, two things were true. One, there was never enough gold. It was all based on confidence. But two, the confidence was eroding because the U.S. ran massive trade deficits and budget deficits, the twin deficits at the same time. Now, there's a case for that. And this was kind of what the Marshall Plan was all about in a much smaller way. But as time went on, at the end of World War II, Germany was in rubble. Japan was in flames and ashes, but they were important economies, and we needed friends to face off against the Soviet Union. So it's very much in our interest to help those countries get back on their feet. Well, how could they do that if they didn't have any money, they didn't have any gold, they didn't have any credit? Well, they did have some. What they really needed was some money and some credit. But you could extend that to them so that they could get manufacturing going, and then they paid it by exporting stuff. So again, around the 60s, the Volkswagen Beetle was a popular item. Japanese transistor radios took them to the beach, et cetera. And so, but that meant the United States had to run trade deficits so that we could run a capital surplus, but had capital deficits because they were borrowing all this money. But it worked. It got the money around, and then, a little bit later, the petrodollar deal was just the ultimate extension of that in 1974. But the problem was confidence was eroding. People were like, how long is the U.S. going to run these deficits? What do they expect us to do? Pile up dollars forever? I mean, the Germans and the Japanese actually did, but the French, Swiss, and the Italians were not so sympathetic. And they developed a run on the bank, on Fort Knox. The gold was going down fast. It was very clear that the gold was soon going to be depleted if Nixon didn't do something. So he got together with John Connally, who was Secretary of the Treasury, Arthur Burns, who was head of the Fed, Paul Volcker, who was not head of the Fed. This is 1971. Volcker was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. So you had Volcker, but he probably knew the most about international economics. You had Volcker, John Connally, Herb Stein, very brilliant economist, Ken Dam, a friend of mine, was later dean of the University of Chicago Law School, that they were going to have to devalue the dollar against gold. They knew that's where it was going to end up. There was just no way they could maintain the $35 because we were running out of gold. And I spoke to two of the people who were at Camp David that weekend, Paul Volcker and Ken Dam, I mentioned, and they both told me what scholars have said, but it was just interesting to talk to people who were there with Nixon. And they said they did not think it was the end of the gold standard. What they thought they were doing, this is what Nixon said. You can find the video clip on YouTube. It was August 15th, 1971. So we're just past the, 70
51, right?
So 1971. So we just passed, I guess, the 45th or 46th anniversary of that. No, that's not right. 71.
51st.
51st. Yeah, that's right. Because last year was the 50th. So we just passed the 51st anniversary of that. But they knew they were going to have to devalue the dollar. But what they said was that we are temporarily suspending the redemption of gold for our foreign trading partners. Now, Nixon used the word temporary. He said that in the speech, and it didn't even get a lot of notice at the time. It was in the same speech he had also announced wage and price controls. Can you imagine the president going on TV today saying, we're going to have wage and price controls starting tomorrow, whatever. And of course, Nixon did the usual. He said, by the way, this will have no impact on the dollar in your pocket yesterday is the same as a dollar in your pocket tomorrow. You still go spend dollars and have a good time. That was only true if you were spending them in the United States. And of course, it opened the door to inflation, but they always say that. But they said, we're going to have another Bretton Woods conference, and we're going to devalue the dollar to some new level to be negotiated and devalue the dollar against other currencies, which they did. That conference took place in Washington in December of 1971. It was called the Smithsonian Accord or the Smithsonian Agreement because that's where they had some of the meetings. They did devalue the dollar from $35 an ounce to $42 an ounce, which is a 20% devaluation. They actually did everything they said they were going to do, except for one thing. They never went back to convertibility. Now, saying the dollar was now worth a different amount in gold is a bookkeeping exercise, but we never went back to a system where foreign trading partners could cash in dollars for gold. And there were some reasons for that. One of them was Germany had what would have been about the strongest currency in the world at the time, but they were trying to honor Bretton Woods. They were trying to maintain this peg to the dollar. There was no euro at the time. It was the Deutsche Mark. But they were trying to maintain a Deutsche Mark dollar peg, which is what Bretton Woods said you were supposed to do. But unlike the British and the French, who were really good products in engineering. So Germany was in effect selling their own currency to suppress the price and buying dollars, but they were up to their eyeballs in dollars. And finally, they said, "We're just going to go to a floating exchange rate. We're going to let the market figure it out." And of course, the Deutsche Mark soared immediately, which devalued the dollar, which is what we were trying to do in the first place. So one by one, countries went on the floating exchange rate. So by the time you got to December, this was all over the course of 1971, some before and some after August 15th. But by the time you got to December 1971, it was kind of over. A lot of countries had gone to floating exchange rates. Milton Friedman advocated it. He was wrong for a lot of reasons, but he was the big voice at the time. It seemed to work okay. And everyone's like, yeah, what's with this gold standard? What's with fixed exchange rates? Let them float. And if your country's in distress and you got to cheapen your dollar, cheapen relative to the dollar, let the market do that for you. Or if the dollar has to devalue, let the market do it for you. We don't need the IMF turning the dials, and we don't need fixed exchange rates. So they never went back. 73. Now everyone says the gold standard ended in 1971. That's not quite right. Nixon did suspend redemptions in 1971. That's right. But it took a couple years for the IMF to demonetize gold. I mean, at the time when you joined the IMF under the Articles of Association written at Bretton Woods, you had to pay like a quota, a membership fee. Well, not a fee, but you had to invest in the IMF. You could give them a certain amount of local currency, but not much, a certain amount of dollars and gold. You had to actually have some gold to join the IMF. That's why the IMF ended up with thousands of tons of gold, and they still have over 1,000 tons of gold to this day, which is a lot. But by 1973, that had changed. So 73, 74 was the real end of gold as an international monetary asset, even though Nixon had suspended redemptions in 1971. But when I was in graduate school, we studied it. We had to study gold as a monetary asset. And I was the last class that did so. I always say, if you're younger than I am and you know anything about gold, you either went to mining college or you're self-taught, because they literally stopped teaching it in universities, and they don't to this day. But my professors, so I was like a 25-year-old grad student, my professors were in their 50s, but they were the young guns at Bretton Woods. Like when they were in their 30s, And I carried that with me ever since.